Dobar dan, veliko zadovoljstvo je danas da nam predstavim Joaquin Floresa, kako se zove, predstavnika Centra za Syncretic Studije, politikologa iz Amerike, analitičara koji se pojavljuje na iranskoj press televiziji i na Russia Today, stručnjaka za geopolitiku, koji će vam danas govoriti o svom viđenju situacije u Srbiji. You told me an interesting thesis about the role of Serbian Progressive Party in Serbia, their stance towards Russia and the West, and what is the role of the Serbian Radical Party there. Could you first please explain us your view on current geopolitical position of government in Serbia and the position of the ruling Serbian Progressive Party?
Yeah, when we met 3 years ago and we began to talk about the role of the Progressive Party and the role of the Radical Party, I said things that at the time were difficult to believe, and one of the reasons that I came upon what I did was that I'm unplugged from the news cycle, and I'm unplugged from the media cycle and popular local analysts. One thing that is true is that it's possible to be too much of an expert about a specific subject and then not be able to see the forest from the trees. And so there's a lot of very excellent analysts in Serbia who are from Serbia, and there's many good well-directioned impulses that Serbians have politically. But there tends to be an issue of looking at the bark on one tree, and the more knowledge, my point is that the more knowledge that you have about a subject, then you tend to ignore information from other related subjects. Or, for example, completely being an expert about Serbia might actually work against understanding what's happening in Serbia, because there are patterns and things happening in other countries that show that there's that it can be modeled. So there's patterns that are happening in Hungary, there's patterns that are happening in Poland and in Ukraine, and while every country has specific details, you can draw general patterns. So what became apparent to me 4 years ago was that the Progressive Party was going to have to play a certain role in between the US and Russia, and that it was going to present itself as a somewhat Eurosceptic pro-EU party that really was aimed at bringing together electorate both from the Radical Party, I guess you could call them the moderates within the Radical Party, and then those from the Democratic Party who also saw the need for Serbian sovereignty within the context of the EU integration. So, but it's really not as boring as that. It's really actually a very highly well-developed project is what I began to tell you. It's been a few years ago now. So really, Russia has had a long-term plan of trying to integrate into the European Union in a way that makes sense to Russia. So a lot of the discourse and a lot of the, I will call it propaganda of Russia versus EU is actually a false construct. It's been known for a long time that Russia's aim is actually to integrate into the European Union, but as the Eurasian Union. And it's actually supposed to be from Iberia to Siberia. And when we used to talk about this, people thought, okay, but this is not like officially Russia's policy. This is just something that surrounding experts and the chattering class like to talk about. But we're talking now in the end of May 2015, and it was only just in March that Lavrov reconfirmed officially in public statements that the goal of Russia is to create a common economic and security zone between Iberia and Siberia. So that's actually Russian policy. So you have to basically work backwards from that fact. And a lot of distracting details about gossip really in Serbia about corruption and what so-and-so said about so-and-so, all of that actually takes away from your understanding of the general trajectory. So back to the real question, then role of the Progressive Party is actually to serve 50% Russian influence and to integrate into the EU, which both the US and EU have agreed would be the course for Serbia. But the question becomes complicated because there's more than one EU. There's competing visions for the EU. So you have the EU Atlanticists, and you have the EU Eurasianists, and then you have the EU Europeanists. And the direction of the EU Europeanists has really determined whether the Atlanticist faction or the Eurasian faction would have more power, because those who want a strong Europe as a goal, and who are not for to be dominated by either the US or by Russia in the view of the Europeanists in the EU, have been trying to figure out, is it time to pivot on the US and the NATO and TIP, or is it to bounce off of Russia? So I know it can be hard to kind of break down and explain in an easy way, but it's not as simple as the Progressive Party is NATO or EU lackey or US lackey. It's not. However, the role of the Radical Party, a similar model, because we talked about models, would be actually to look at Hungary, where you have Fidesz and Jobbik. And really the role of Radical Party is to play the role of Jobbik, and for Fidesz to be the kind of center-right Eurosceptic party, but they're not breaking out of the EU, but they're Eurosceptics, but they've allowed for a policy that Russia finds to be quite acceptable in all spheres. And in fact, they face a lot of danger from the US, talking about in Hungary, for their pro-Russian positions. And I can see a similar thing emerging in
Now the thing is, there are some counter-arguments to your theory. For example, a few days ago, Aleksandar Vučić in Tirana said that Serbia will work with their US friends on diversification of the gas supplies in Serbia by connecting to the Trans-Adriatic pipeline from Azerbaijan. How do you comment on that statement, and is that statement compatible with Russian-friendly policy of the Serbian government?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but to sort of break it down in simple terms, to dissect it really, what it is this. There is no Trans-Adriatic pipeline that can exist taking gas from Azerbaijan that's not part of the Turkish-Russian stream. So it's actually, because what happened is that in Azerbaijan, there's a project to expand the gas fields in the Caspian Sea, and this is being managed by a consortium called the Shah Deniz II Consortium. And they already have the agreement with Turkey, and the US is basically trying to reintroduce the specter of multiple competing projects. But the three projects that already existed in prior developmental stages have already been compressed and negotiated into the Russian-Turkish pipeline. So what the US is talking about can't be a competing line that exists in physical reality with another competing line. What it is a competing project to nullify the Turkish-Russian stream. You can't have both, because it doesn't, because the total volume of gas that can be taken out of the Shah Deniz II Consortium expansion project would not adequately fulfill the needs of two existing parallel pipelines, both running through either the Black Sea or through Turkey. And also the expense required to build a pipeline that was parallel to the existing lines or to the plans to expand the capacity of the existing route also doesn't make sense economically. So there's a certain level of fiction about the talk. If the U.S. wants to be involved in the Russian-Turkish plan and only pick up basically from the Russian-Turkish pipeline through the Balkans, and then just be involved in that piece that takes it from the Balkans across the Adriatic, the U.S. has sent signals that it's interested in doing that, but Russia does not oppose that. In fact, Russia and U.S. bilateral trade has increased like 7 or 8% in the last year, even in the context of sanctions and in the cooling of relations between U.S. and Russia. The business interests are still there. So there is a geopolitical angle, but it's not a contradictory project. There can only actually be one or the other. In that sense, there's a contradiction. But there's no contradiction that the U.S. could be involved in the Russian project. I know that doesn't sit right well with sort of ideological frameworks of U.S. versus Russia, but in reality, these projects work often hand in hand. Now, that's separate from what Vučić is saying and why he's saying it. In the years that basically ended up with what happened, in the years that basically that brought us to the catastrophe in Ukraine, and the way also that we saw Bulgaria flip about and ultimately back out of the South Stream project, when Vučić appears to follow this script, he's well advised and he's well aware that this is a script and that this is the only way to manage it. The amount of pressure on Vučić from the West is extraordinary, and they are threatening to remove him from power. But the reasons that he will be removed from power, if he is removed in a popular uprising, will be actually the opposite reasons for the reasons that the U.S. wants to remove him. What do I mean? Well, the U.S. has gotten him to do a number of things that are actually very unpopular in Serbia, and those are actually the things that people will rise up to remove him for. But the U.S. will actually be the ones managing his removal, so that 5 or 10% of Serbian electorate which supports the liberal agenda, they will actually find all of their representatives in the next government if Vučić is removed. So that's actually the conundrum.
Could you please for us make an analogy with the case of Yanukovych and Assad, because you explained to me once that there is a similar pattern there.
Well, right, that analogy fits very well. I think it's been pointed out already by many people that that in the years leading up to Assad's uprising against Assad, that he did a lot of things that were actually pro-Western, and Yanukovych also played a game of vacillating back and forth between Russia and the EU and the U.S. interest in the EU, to the point where he actually lost credibility on all sides. The thing is that this model is that the people who are consulting Vučić are not blind to the fact that this has happened. But it's also important, so much of this is about sending the right signals. So it gets complex. I mean, Vučić brought on Tony Blair as a political consultant, but that's really more for show, because there's nothing that Tony Blair could advise Vučić to do except the very things that will get him overthrown. So it becomes very complicated. Really, one of the things that I know Serbians understand, but it's hard to keep in mind, is that prior to this campaign that was launched to defend Syrian civilization and to support the government of Assad, Assad was not highly popular among all segments of Syrian society, and in fact, the things that he had done that made him increasingly unpopular were those things that made Syria a better place for foreign investment, were those things that the US and the West asked him to do, which he did do, and then those were used against him. And then the groups that attacked him could also create the illusion that they were not working for the US, because they attack him for the things that he did that were pro-Western. And that's actually the same script in Serbia. Vučić is trying to get himself overthrown, we can say, but it's through these competing advisors. And it's really impossible to determine under which influence he has, because he's giving all the right signs to both sides. The problem that happens in the population is they do get fed up with games, and they do get fed up with mixed signals. So if the government in Serbia is going to stay, we should expect him to be put into a situation where he has to make a definitive stand. For example, Assad finally had to, say no to a power sharing. Yanukovych had to finally say no to the association agreement. Numerous cases like this really illustrate that there is a breaking point. You can't go on forever. But the analogies are apt. The problem is that when we defend Syrian civilization from Western attacks, we can't forget the things that really caused Assad to be so unpopular. There was a legitimate aspect to the uprising, and it was those pro-Western things. That's the problem. Vučić is now very much hated by broad segments of the society, but Serbian society, except for the most vocal of the elites and media who distort how we see it, but most average Serbians would like to see Serbia have better and better relations with Russia, and they would like to see a security agreement with Russia. So the 2011 observer status that Serbia gained in the CSTO, most Serbians would like to see that become a full partnership in CSTO. But the problem is that also when Serbians focus on Serbian media, they are getting trolled actually by the propaganda on both sides. So really complicated.
So in that whole framework that you explained so far, could you possibly explain us further the role of the Serbian Radical Party and Vojislav Šešelj?
So, yeah, basically, in the model where the Progressive Party is supposed to be, is actually very well contacted by Russian advisors and Russian planners. Okay, and they have very, very many good contacts, and to the extent that the role of the Progressive Party is to slowly massage Serbia into a more and more Russian position, following that model, that theory, right, which makes sense. I mean, there's no doubt that the Russians are trying to do this. The only question is whether, whether the U.S. will interfere successfully. The role of the Radical Party is to make the Progressive Party seem like more rational, more European, more pro-Western than they are. So the role of the Radical Party, the correct role, they have actually played the correct role, is to attack the Progressive Party for everything that's pro-West. So when in the European chattering class, Americans don't follow this, and their analysts only follow what European analysts tell them. So really the battle is over Europe in the propaganda war in Serbia. And when the Europeans pick up on media reports and Serbian nationalists like the Radical Party are denouncing and attacking the Progressive Party, then actually Progressive Party is doing its role correctly and Radical Party is doing its role correctly. It creates the idea that the Progressive Party are the rational, moderate people. They're the party you can negotiate with, and it makes their claims that they're interested in EU integration, which Serbia is 10 or 12 years away from even approaching at the fastest possible speed, makes those claims seem more realistic. So there's a lot of theatrics and creation of hyper-reality. There's a simulacrum involved in that. So in a way, it's like a hoax, but it can be hard for people to swallow if they spend a lot of time, if they're Serbians and they're reading Serbian news and they follow Serbian propaganda from the political faction that they follow, They will not get an accurate picture of the models that are being used in other countries and in Serbia.
You left out about Šešelj and his specific role.
His release from The Hague has a lot of mystery around it, and there was a lot of conspiracy theories about who let him out and why. It makes most sense to me that America and Russia agreed to manage him being released, and that America expected him to attack Vučić from the nationalist angle, and that then that would create a popular movement and big street protests from which they could launch a Arab color tactic. Of course, the liberals and the most pro-US faction of the DS would assume power at that point. There would be no agreements with Russia at all about anything in that scenario. It wouldn't be like a return to 2002 or 2004 where you could have a pro-Western government that had some deals with Russia. The world has changed and it's become polarized from the American perspective. So the US really hoped that Šešelj would be agitating against Vučić. That was his job. But Šešelj is by and large, well, really a genius politically, and he's been studying and reading this. He's been like, you know, Rocky, training and training all these years in The Hague. You know, he hasn't been distracted by, you know, wine, women, and song, and he's been like a kung fu monk in there, just reading, and analyzing. And he has had full access to media, and he hasn't lost touch with what's going on. I would say Šešelj probably understands what's going on in Serbia better than most of the chattering class who are so good at critiquing things but could never create a model on their own. So the role of Šešelj, you know, the real truth is that he can't really say what he really knows because people couldn't accept it. And it's not good in propaganda to like be too complicated. Like, you can see that I've had a hard time just today, you know, breaking down a lot of things that are very complicated, and people don't really have an attention span for that, and you have to kind of put things in black and white terms. So that's where you see a lot of the question marks and like gaps and missing spaces in what the things that Šešelj is saying and not saying, because it's his statements and his publicly stated views are formatted for mass consumption, and you know, there's no indication that he's been bought off. There's no indication that he is slowed down or that he's out of touch. You just have to understand that Serbia is entering a new phase where, you know, real outbreak of war is and destabilization, as we've seen in Republic of Srpska and more so in Macedonia, is a real possibility. In fact, it's the fact that it hasn't happened so far right now, in fact, is already a small success. The problem is that we take stability for granted, and we don't see the things that didn't happen because people behind the scenes were making sure of that. So to summarize, I would say that the Russians are actually very heavily involved behind the Progressive Party and the Radical Party, and that they've managed a sort of theatrics which is meant to confuse the Americans but involve the Europeans in a way, getting back to the real point that Serbia may integrate into the EU at some point in 10 or 15 or 20 years, but it would really be only on, you know, without a war over Serbia. It would happen in a way that Russia actually agrees to, and it would actually be a European Union that was more like a Eurasian Union. So the words that we use can be complicated and not really describe things well. You know, that's the reality of the world we live in. It's not black and white.
What would be your message to the Serbian people?
Well, you have to be really just careful about vague and general calls for protests against the Vučić government. It's good to put increasing pressure on the government, but never in alliance with the liberals. And when you do have demands, they can't be vague about like corruption or things that the liberals agreed to. The only legitimate critique of Vučić is not moving more quickly or not moving more coherently in a Eurasian pro-Russian direction. so long as that criticism is not vague, so long as it's actually the banner, you know, for Kosovo, for Russia, you have to have it be that clear. You can't have CNN and BBC come in, right, and superimpose some other slogan on your demonstrations, because that's what they do all over the world. So in the media war, you have to have your point people ready to interact with media from the West and be clear that any protest you're having is because not of vague things like corruption, lack of democracy, dictatorship, or all the things that the Color Spring and Gene Sharp tactic is based upon. It must be clear that the criticism is based upon a lack of building more secure and coherent ties with Russia. And I hate to be so polarized like that, but you can't be vague. And it can't be a popular protest that involves all segments of Serbian society, including pro-Western liberals. No such alliance is conceivable, and any proposal for such an alliance is precisely a Western tactic to actually push you in a much more Western direction very quickly.